Well, hello to another weekly talking point, and it's my great pleasure to introduce today Dr. Alice Doherty.
Hi.
And you're the Programme Lead for BSc Psychology at UDOL, University of Derby Online.
Right.
So thanks for joining us.
Nice to.
We're going to get into some issues around comorbidity and some of the content on this week's unit, but also specifically we're going to focus down on language, which is Doherty's specialism. So we'll get into that into some detail. But before we do that, I just got a few sort of housekeeping things. I want to mention, of course, the Twitter hashtag, which is very, very popular at the moment. So that's hashtag AAAMOOC, M-O-O-C, AAAMOOC. Please contribute to that and join in the lively discussions and posts there. Also, you can contact me or friend me, whatever it is, on Twitter. I'm at Milton Broom. There's plenty of links out there. Please feel free to do that and contribute to the discussion, and we'll keep that going. If you do have any questions, please continue to post them on the discussion boards. The discussions are going very, very well there. There's loads of lively debate going on. So today's topic then is Unit 5, Comorbidity. What I want to do is just very, very briefly introduce you to some of the key points then. So the main thing to realise about comorbidity is that it's one of these sort of odd topics that I don't think many people really understand that well. It's to do with the interchange of symptoms within diagnosable conditions. So some people say it's a condition that goes alongside another condition. So some people sort of see it's an interaction with the primary diagnosis. So it's not as clear cut as perhaps these immediate definitions give. You've got dual diagnosis and separate diagnosis, but the reality is symptoms just present, and we happen to combine them into these tight categories depending on what the latest issue of the DSM or the ICD or whatever diagnostic manual procedure you're working to is. So there's a high degree of overlap between the symptoms of ADHD and autism, and that in part is why we've chosen to cluster both ADHD and autism within the same topic, as it were. So some of the symptoms of autism, some of the symptoms of ADHD, if you do indeed want to use the medical model and call them symptoms, they overlap, and you can misdiagnose one for the other, and I think that happens quite often, and it's something that clinicians and people doing diagnosis need to watch out for. But the comorbidities, the associated disorders, especially in ADHD, can be misunderstood for actually the primary symptoms of say, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. For example, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, these sort of behavioural disorders can be seen just as sort of naughty children often, and if that reaches a sort of pathological level, you reach a diagnostic point where that becomes problematic. You've got a situation where, well, is it ADHD, is it oppositional defiant disorder, is it conduct disorder? And then there are all of the sort of the other disorders, the big units like the personality disorders, the big behavioural disorders there. So there are different clusters of sets of diagnosis that we can give appropriate to the symptoms as they're clustered together in these diagnostic manuals. So it's the comorbidity, the high shared variance or the heterogeneity and the crossover of these symptoms which presents real problems for people doing diagnosis, and it's that which I'd like you to sort of look at and say to yourself, well, is what this person is presenting with actually unique enough to call it, say, autism or ADHD, or is it better represented by some other condition? So, for example, the schizophrenias, of which there are many, can often present sometimes like autism, but you could feasibly have autism and one of the schizophrenias there, or ADHD and depression or dysthymia or whatever it might be. But it's always in the best interest of the person going forward through diagnosis, ultimately into treatment or an intervention, to receive either dual diagnosis or to see these conditions as separable and caused by unique etiologies. So things that are causing them are independent of one another. So it's a very, very complex set of situations where we ask, well, what's causing it? How does it present? What do we call it? Are they independent or are they shared? Is there a crossover there between the two? I've got a bit of a cold, so I'm snivelling away. So I'll just try and soldier on. But what I want to do now then is just reach out to you in terms of your expertise in psychology, psycholinguistics, and I know you've done some really interesting research there. Could you tell us a little bit about your background and some of your experience and studies in psychology and psycholinguistics?
Absolutely. So my interests in psychology date back quite a long time, and interestingly I particularly became interested in psychology and educational psychology when before I went to university, I worked in a school for autistic children, so it's interesting that I'm coming round in this circle a little bit. I went to AT University and completed a degree and became really interested in language and how complex language is really, but yet how simple we typically find it. I conducted my PhD looking at language and how we integrate different levels of language. So there are all sorts of different layers of language that we have. You have syntax or grammar, you have the semantics or meaning, but there are also other cues and things that we use in order to understand what people are saying and what they're referring to. So things like pragmatics and areas like that. So my PhD focused on how we integrate all that different information. And I used pronouns, so words like he, she and it, which they're highly ambiguous, to explore that, because you do need to, in understanding pronouns, you do need to draw on a range of information. So that's my PhD in a nutshell.
Wow, that's got wide. That crosses through all of psychology, doesn't it? Because you need language for almost everything. And,
exactly.
And there's an argument that even our thoughts, our internalized processing of procedures, and I'm going to do this, I think this, starts out as some kind of internalized language, and then of course it develops into automated thought.
And it even language shapes your thought as well. So depending on on the way that you refer to things, that will change the way that you conceptualize those things. And colour's a really nice example of that. Oh, right. So different languages have different colour categories.
Okay.
And they'll perceive colour differently, depending on the categories that they use for those colours. So
that's fascinating.
Quite a nice example.
Yeah, so there's a cultural element to it as well.
Yeah.
So I suppose that's brought out in the child's development as well. So they not only have the genetic inheritance that comes with the ability to, there's different strands of form, isn't there? With Chomsky or Skinner and all of this business, But also the cultural element is all about the interaction with the environment. So if you're brought up in there's that fallacy about Inuits or Eskimos, isn't there?
Yeah.
How many words for snow or whatever it is, I read an article that says actually I haven't got that many words.
No, they don't.
They don't. So I'm right on one thing. So there is a lot of faff around pop psychology about language, but it's nice to appreciate that in people with autism and to a degree in people with ADHD, we see these comorbidities that actually can sit outside but interact with the primary diagnosis there. It's
and I think it depends very much on the individual as well. So you can have you can have particular areas of difficulty. So you can have people who are very sophisticated in their use of grammar, for example. They can produce very sophisticated sentences, but have particular challenges in areas like pragmatics. So in understanding that process of using language socially, turn-taking, for example, like we're doing now. And so you can get very specific deficits in particular areas.
In Asperger's syndrome, Asperger's disorder, you see a very, very high level often of spoken language. So just as you were describing, and in children at almost an adult level, where they'll converse with adults around them, almost sort of in parrot-like fashion, they're regurgitating key sentences and words and phrases that they've heard, sometimes in context. But then you ask them about, and I've done this in schools, you ask them about what they mean, and the comprehension is very much lagging there. So you have a discrepancy between, expressive language and receptive language there.
And idiomatic language as well.
Oh, yeah.
So, sometimes some of the turns of phrase that we use, it's often very difficult for some individuals to understand that.
Well, there's probably more crossover in our PhDs than we realise. I did mine at Essex University in populations of children, 7 to 12-year-olds, who show the symptoms of ADHD, so hyperactivity and inattentiveness. And I particularly focused in on the pragmatic domain. And on the whole, what I was finding was that it was the inattentive children, or those children in mainstream schools who showed the inattentive profile of ADHD, who are more impaired on their pragmatic language ability. And I use things like homonyms, idioms, sort of metaphor. And an example would be you show a child a picture of an illustration with a little stick figure or a cartoon of this person jumping around like this. You say he's got ants in his pants, and they have to choose from 4 ways of sort of decoding would be the technical phrase of what that phrase meant. And it was the inattentive children that went for the literal meaning. So someone who's actually physically got ants in their pants, rather than the phrase, that we use in the common meaning of it. So I think there are these traps that people can fall into quite easily. In the English language, it's crazy because most of it is full of this type of language. They call it, is it opaque?
Yes, things like kick the bucket, for example. How on earth do you begin understanding what kick the bucket means?
Okay. There's probably some legacy of what it means to be strung up on a tree, and then they kick the bucket from out you, and then you die. But if you didn't know that, you've no way of working out what that means. Yeah. And most of it, you haven't got a way back to find out what it is. But anyway, it's English language. We could go on for hours. So I really wanted to quiz you then. What are your thoughts on comorbid disorders in autism and ADHD? Things like, semantic pragmatic disorder and all these different conceptualizations of complex language disorders.
So as I understand it, these comorbid disorders, you, in order to gain a diagnosis of social pragmatic disorder, it's necessary to discount autism first. So actually, within the DSM, you're not able to get a dual diagnosis for those 2 disorders. Am I correct?
Well, it's people are more likely to see them as 2 discrete things and then treat one and treat the other. But no, I mean you can have 2 diagnoses now, but really, if it's better explained by one rather than the other, that's the primary diagnosis. I think that rule still holds. And you've got sort of social communication disorder, which is pushing people away from autism. But then there might be a lot of autism traits. Traits isn't the right word, is it? It's sort of markers, technically symptoms, contained in that language disorder, but it doesn't characterise the whole thing. Whether that's a good thing or not, I don't know.
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? Because I think these labels, I think they potentially take you away from the actual experiences of an autistic child and or a child with ADHD, and so I guess it raises that issue of treatment. Are you treating the disorder, or are you treating the symptoms of the disorder? And I think that's the real challenge with those labels, in my opinion. That's
a really good point, actually. Do you see if you've only got one treatment you can offer because the local authority is funding behavioural treatment or whatever it might be, then everyone's going to get farmed into the same thing anyway. So because I very rarely hear that you get an individualised treatment schedule. Okay, you do to an extent in school plans and IEPs and EHCPs, whatever they're called now. But most of this stuff, especially the parental interventions, it's group stuff, just because of the economy of scale. And it kind of loses track of the individual there. So within the language disorders, even the word disorder is troublesome, isn't
No, I
it? There's this clustering, you're this but not that, this but not that, not this. But if you've got a child that lags with comprehension and you're using an assessment where you're asking them loads of complex stuff, you don't really know if they're understanding it, and that can have an impact on the assessment. And
in an educational setting as well, for example, so you might have a child that has difficulty with expressive language. That's going to have that's going to impact other areas for that child. So they might be becoming very frustrated. They might become socially withdrawn. So it's capturing all those challenges that child is facing. It becomes really difficult. Yeah,
that's a good point actually, because I've been in contact with young children with autism. Well, I have worked with autistic people who are non-verbal, but have fantastic awareness of what people are saying around them. Like really spot on the ball, and they might use PECS or something, picture exchange communication system, some kind of way of communicating, or like an iPad type device to communicate. In very, very good English sentences, with a real insight there, but they're just non-verbal. So there's this perception, I think, that because you're not very good at spoken language, you're somehow less bright, or you don't understand what's going on around you. And that's just not the case, especially in people with autism.
No.
It's a real problem, I think, within the field, that we make these assumptions. So it moves on to the DSM and the ICD. So the diagnostic manuals there. What's your view on these classification approaches using these manuals then?
Well, I think, you've already touched a little bit on some of the necessity for those diagnostic labels in terms of gaining access to resource. But I think there is also that risk, as I've already said, in terms of labelling someone with something, and you then just don't capture the very diverse range of different challenges that person might be facing, and it differs by individual.
Because some people reject these classifications. They certainly don't like the idea of a disorder, particularly within autism, I think. And that's just up against a brick wall with the DSM, because that's all about you have this, therefore you go down the system. But I think it's important to know that this isn't the only way of looking at it. It's very much a psychiatry type legacy, I think. Will it change in the future? Doubt it. Who knows? We're stuck with it for now, I think. All right, so that moves us on then. You're in a good position within academia and psychology to advise parents who are coming up against this idea that a child might be lagging with their language or have a specific language impairment or specific language disorder. Have you got any advice or tips for parents who suspect that their children have that sort of problem?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the key thing is to gain some support, and you can gain access to resources by GP referral, and a speech and language therapist would be able to support with a range of different aspects of elements of communicative disorders. It's not just they don't just offer support with speech difficulties, but they can support in all sorts of different aspects of communication.
When are they sort of first identified in school? It's because they can crop up. They're quite subtle in a lot of instances, aren't they? It's kind of, I've this notion that when a child first enters school, they're compared to their peers, and there's almost like this natural control group, and it's then, that these not abnormalities but differences are first sort of show up. And you see it in the literature when they hit their first formal schooling. There's a massive surge in diagnosis there. And I'm wondering if there's a difference between parents with one child and parents with two children, in that they can plot the differences there between first and second child. It's difficult to know actually where the sort of sensitive periods come in for saying, well, the child should have achieved this amount of language, or.
And I think those, in fact, I think those milestones are every child is different.
Oh, right, okay,
and if children aren't necessarily meeting the milestones that you're expecting, then there can be a number of different factors that influence that.
Right.
So you can see delayed language development, for example, if you're speaking two languages within the home and things like that. It's very difficult to say there's a set point when you should start to have concerns. And there are cues that you can look for. I don't know.
One of the things I've come up against is this idea that there's a sensitive period for learning a second language here. And if you don't learn it really early on, you kind of never lose your accent. You don't get past that.
That's not quite true. You can have the. So I think for the vast majority of the population, they would they would still retain an accent, but you can. Some people do. They can actually learn a language later on and lose the accent.
Okay.
And I think that's to do with we have different sensitivities to different elements of language, and I think there are some people who are particularly good at picking up the phonology of language, so the sound patterns in language.
Yeah, not me, I know that. I tried to learn French and was completely lost. Yeah, and Portuguese is just it could be Chinese, or not that Chinese is difficult to learn. I don't know. So the point is that this notion of comorbidity can interact with things like specific language impairment. It's not just the language domain. Obviously, as I've mentioned, you've got the anxiety disorders, the personality disorders, all of these other domains of functioning there. But language is one of the things that is so important in school. There's such a focus on getting that right that a child on the autistic spectrum, or with ADHD and other considerations, might have sort of complexities there that go undiscovered for some time, because somebody might say, oh, that's just their autism, or that's just their ADHD, or there's this, there's that. I think it's important to see that you never just have a single primary diagnosis. No. That might be the same, I don't know, with language impairment, with language disorders.
Yes. I mean, you can get clusters of difficulty.
Right.
Williams syndrome, for example, is typically people can speak very fluent language.
Okay.
But there isn't an awful lot of meaning behind what they're saying.
Okay. So that's got overlap with Asperger's in some sense, isn't it? So they've got this very charismatic, robotic type of little professor type voice.
Yeah.
But then if there's no meaning behind it, it's kind of like, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. Yeah. Okay. So that's something I suppose that we need more research in the area of, sort of prizing apart language disorders from the comorbidity with autism spectrum disorders conditions and ADHD. So you're program leader for psychology at the University of Derby Online.
Yes.
Have you got any courses that our learners might be interested in?
So we do currently offer a range of courses in psychology.
Yeah.
And the point at which you enter will depend on your level of previous experience and previous study. We have a BSc program in psychology and an MSc program in psychology.
Okay.
Both of these offer accreditation with the BPS.
Yep.
which for people who are interested in going into areas like educational psychology, for example, that's necessary to gain access to further training routes.
Yeah.
And the difference between those two courses, so the BSc is particularly suited to people who haven't done any study at graduate level before.
I see.
But the MSc offers a quick conversion in psychology for students who have done a first degree but are looking at moving into the area of psychology.
Right, great. So there's a few jump-off points there if people want to continue their journey within psychology. Great. Well, thank you very much for just sharing some of your insights today. That's been fascinating. Thank you very much. I must just mention that Alice and myself are going to be doing some collaborative research, and the link will go up on the MOOC, and also I believe in an announcement out to you from next week, week 6. We're in week 5 currently. And we'll share and invite you to come in and take part as a participant in that research, and there'll be more details about that later on. Please continue to offer up your questions on the discussion and comments forums there, and keep the lively debate going. And an announcement, we've just passed 10,000 people enrolled on the MOOC, which is absolutely fantastic, and it just shows how much interest there is in the topic.
Absolutely. And it's an important topic, isn't it?
I think so, yeah. So congratulations to all our learners and everyone involved. And thank you once again for listening in on this weekly talking point, and we'll see you again next week. Thank you.